The Greek word thumos doesn't really translate cleanly into English, but the closest translations are spiritedness, or spirit, or heart, or the spirited part of the soul. However, none of these really capture what thumos actually meant for the Greeks, because the way they understood it, thumos is the part of us that gets indignant when we see something that is base. It is the part that supplies the force within us that allows us to endure difficulty. It is the part that loves honor and that is capable of being ashamed. And it is also the part that allows reason to be acted on and not just entertained. So thumos is essentially the energy of a person's life. And the question of how it gets formed is one of those questions that essentially ran through the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. Now, in Book 4 of the Republic, Plato makes the argument that the soul has parts, and his reason for thinking this is that we can observe our internal conflicts in ourselves all the time. Think about it. The thirsty person who refuses to drink the water right in front of them because they know that the water is contaminated, this person can't be a unified thing, because one and the same thing cannot at the same time desire something and refuse it at the same time. So whatever is doing the desiring and whatever is doing the refusing, these have to be two completely different things. And so Plato concludes that reason and appetite are, in fact, distinct parts of the soul. But if this is true, then he has to show that thumos isn't just some appetite under another name. And he does this with the story of a man named Leontius. In the story, Leontius is walking up from the Praotēs, so the docks, along the outside of the northern wall on his way back to Athens. And as he passes near the place where the public executioner has left all the bodies of the condemned, he sees the corpses that are lying there on the ground in the distance. And immediately he feels the desire, the intense desire to look at them and check them out. This is basically the strange and base curiosity that pulls us toward the things that we know that we shouldn't really want to see. So Leontius tries to resist this at first. He covers his face with his hands. He turns his head away, and he struggles with himself for some time, going back and forth, debating with himself whether he should see them or not. But eventually he gives in, and his desire wins out. So he runs over there, where the corpses are lying on the ground, with his eyes wide open, and he forces himself to look. And as he does this, he shouts at his own eyes. He says, "Look for yourself, you wretches. Have your fill of the beautiful sight." Now, the point Plato is trying to make with this story is that this internal conflict is not like an argument between reason and appetite. The argument Leontius has with himself isn't a rational deliberation about whether looking at some corpse is good for him over the long run or for his life. It is actually something much more immediate. Leontius is disgusted with this desire. He is angry at himself for actually having it. And what is angry at this desire has to be something other than the desire itself, because the desire can't be both wanting the thing and also revolted at its own wanting at the same time. So this thing that gets angry at any desire is what Plato calls thumos. And then Plato makes the second claim, which is meant to show that thumos isn't reason or rationality either. And his argument here is that thumos usually can show up in children and also in wild beasts or animals well before reason has been developed at all. Just like a small child can be indignant at unfairness without being able to think about justice, a dog can be angry at being treated badly without having any concept of justice. So thumos can't really be reason because thumos also exists in creatures where reason isn't yet developed or operational or can ever be developed. In other words, thumos is its own thing. It sits between reason and appetite, and it has its own specific function. Thumos is essentially the source of indignation, so the response in us that registers when something is base. It is also the source of the love of honor, so the part of us that cares about being treated well and with respect, and it is also the part that is capable of being ashamed when we fail. It is also the source of endurance, so the part that allows us to sustain effort through discomfort. And maybe most importantly, thumos is the source of the force that lets reason's judgment actually be acted on. Because without Thumos, reason can see what is right, it can judge what is right, but have essentially no way to act on it. In which case, this judgment will just exist in the soul without having anything to carry it out into reality. So Thumos is essentially what closes this gap. It closes the gap between judgment and action. Now, the way Plato sees it, Thumos and reason are not in tension with one another by nature. Most people, they tend to imagine the soul as a kind of struggle between calm, rational thought on the one hand and various forceful temptations or impulses on the other. And under that assumption, anything that is spirited in us is treated as a problem that our rationality or our reason has to manage. But this isn't really what Plato says, since the forceful impulses in the conception of his soul are appetites. So Thumos is something completely different here. And the relationship between Thumos and reason is essentially not one of struggle, but of natural alliance. And Plato makes this distinction clearest in his Phaedrus, which is one of the dialogues where he discusses the soul. And there he describes the soul as a charioteer driving two winged horses. These horses are essentially pulling in different directions, and the charioteer's job is to keep them moving together. And what is interesting here is that the two horses are very different from one another. One of the horses, Plato says, is of noble breed. This horse is white, it is upright in figure, and it is well jointed. It carries its neck high and has a hooked nose and dark eyes. It is a lover of honor, it is a lover of modesty, and a friend of true glory. But the most important thing about this horse is that it responds to words and admonition alone. The charioteer doesn't need to whip the horse, he just speaks to it, and the horse will adjust according to speech. But the other horse is the complete opposite in every single way. This horse is black, it is crooked, it is lumpish, it has a huge frame, it has a thick neck and a snub nose, it has bloodshot eyes, and it has shaggy ears. This horse is the companion of insolence. It hardly yields to whip or spur, and even with the spur, it will keep trying to pull the charioteer, of course. Now, obviously, the noble horse is Thumos, and the unruly dark horse is appetite, and the charioteer, in this case, is reason. What the image is essentially telling us is that Thumos is the part of the soul that wants to do what reason tells it to do. It listens, it responds to the words, and it doesn't need to be coerced. And what this means is that the contemporary intuition that anything spirited in us is a problem to be controlled has the whole idea exactly backwards. The part of the soul that needs to be physically restrained is not our Thumos, it is actually appetite. Thumos is actually the part that is already on the side of reason, but only if it has been formed correctly. And this quote-unquote if is doing a lot of work here, because Plato is also clear that Thumos can be captured by the wrong thing. And in Book 8 of the Republic, he describes what actually happens when Thumos gets pulled away from reason and starts to serve appetite instead. And he calls the person whose soul is ordered in this kind of way the timocratic person. And the timocratic person is essentially whose love of honor has been detached from any real understanding of what is actually good. This person still wants honor, he still wants the recognition, and he still wants to be excellent. But what he counts as honor has been corrupted by his own appetites. And as a result of all this, his Thumos is now supplying its force to whatever appetite has put in front of it. In other words, the person whose pride attaches itself too close to sexual conquest or to wealth or to dominance over other people, this person has an ill-formed Thumos. The energy, it still looks forceful from the outside or sometimes even impressive, but the ordering of the soul underneath it is completely corrupt because the spirited part of the soul is now being used as a tool for appetite. And Plato treats this as one of the most central failures of the soul because it produces someone who can be very effective at acquiring the things they want without ever asking themselves whether those things actually are worth wanting. And then there's the opposite failure, which is the deadened Thumos. And this is the person in which the spirited part of the soul has completely gone silent. It is the person who can't really be indignant at anything. It is the person who isn't really moved by what should move them, or who can't really be ashamed of themselves when they should be. And Plato treats this kind of person as the more contemptible failure of the two, because it is the failure of the part of the soul that makes us actually capable of taking action. The way Plato sees it, the timocratic person, at least, still has some energy in them. It has some drive in them. Even if this drive has been misdirected, well, the deadened person doesn't really even have that. And what's left in this case is essentially something that can't really respond to the world effectively at all. So Thumos has two characteristic deformations. On the one hand, Thumos can be captured by appetite, or on the other hand, it can be silenced. And neither of these are really failures of strength or willpower. What they actually are failures of formation. So the captured Thumos has been formed in the wrong direction, while the deadened Thumos has not yet been formed at all. Now, Aristotle talks about the concept of Thumos in his book 4 of his Nicomachean Ethics, where he addresses it in the context or in the form of anger specifically. And the virtue concerning anger here he calls Praotēs, which gets translated as good temper or as gentleness. And just as courage is the virtue concerning fear, and as generosity is the virtue concerning money, Praotēs is the virtue concerning anger. And it has the same structure, just like every other virtue in Aristotle's account, which means that it is a mean between two opposite failures or extremes. And the two failures here are exactly what you'd expect them to be. The excess is irascibility, so being angry at the wrong things with the wrong people, more than is fitting for the situation and for far too long. And the deficiency is the failure to be angry at what should actually anger you. And as we said in the previous video, the formed person is the person whose anger actually sits at the right place between these two extremes. They are angry at what should anger them, in the way it should anger them, for the right reason, towards the right people, and of course, for the right amount of time. And here, Aristotle claims that the deficiency is the more common failure than the excess. And in his mind, the person who doesn't really get angry at things that should anger them is, in his own words, thought to be a fool. He says this directly. The person who tolerates insult to those they love, or the person who is unmoved by injustice, or the person who endures being treated badly out of some confusion with patience, this person is a fool. Aristotle is openly contemptuous of all of them. He calls these kind of people servile. He says that they don't defend themselves or those they care about, and that this is, in fact, shameful. And this isn't a position we find often anymore these days. Our contemporary culture treats emotional smoothness as a sign of maturity. And the absence of anger is treated like something that is closer to a virtue, while Aristotle actually treats it as a moral failure, and not even a minor moral failure. He treats it as one of the central failures of character, because the failure to respond to what should actually anger us is the failure of the spirited part of the soul. And a person whose Thumos has gone silent is a person who can't really act on what they know to be right. But of course, excess is also a real failure. And Aristotle distinguishes between several kinds of irascibilities, because getting angry too much can actually take a lot of forms. There is, for example, the choleric person, who is quick to anger and quick to be calm. So basically someone who is hot-tempered. Then there is the bitter person, who holds onto anger long after the occasion has actually passed, and who can't really just move past it. And finally, there is also the sullen person, who can't really express what they feel, and so they retain this anger indefinitely until it comes out at the wrong time towards the wrong person. Each of these is a different way of getting the calibration of anger wrong. The choleric person, he needs to slow his responses. The bitter person needs to let go of his anger when the occasion is past, and the sullen person needs to be somehow capable of expressing their anger when it actually comes up. And here, we also have to go back to the concept of the previous video about asymmetric work, because the work of forming our Thumos, or our character, is of course different depending on which way each of us naturally tilt. For example, the person whose anger runs hot has to pull against this hot temper. They have to develop the capacity to not respond to things that actually don't warrant a response, or at least an angry response. On the other hand, the person whose anger runs cold, or who is more, let's say, even-tempered, they need to pull in the other direction. They have to develop the capacity to be moved by what should move them. In other words, the work that has to be done is usually the opposite to our nature, which means that the process of our formation, or character formation, is therefore different for every single person. And here there is, of course, once again, a particular trap that is worth being mindful of. And this is the trap of self-perception. For example, the person whose anger runs hot, right? This person doesn't usually see themselves as choleric. Instead, they see themselves as quote-unquote principled. They see their anger as the appropriate response to a world that warrants it. And they tell themselves a story about how their temper is justified or just a result of having higher standard than most other people. On the other hand, the person whose anger runs cold, this person usually doesn't see themselves as deficient either. Instead, they like to see themselves as dignified. They tell themselves a story about how their lack of anger is actually mature restraint, and not the absence of the capacity that should actually be there. And in both cases, this kind of self-perception is wrong. The first person is choleric. The second person is deadened. But neither of them can see it without doing the work that we argued in the previous video, which is the work of seeing one's own natural tilt accurately, and not the tilt one would actually prefer to have. So if we put all of this together, then the question becomes, what does a correctly formed Thumos actually look like in practice? And here, the first thing we have to understand is that the formed Thumos responds automatically to what should actually move it. So genuine indignation at what is actually base, actual anger at what is actually wrong, and the capacity to be ashamed of ourselves when our conduct doesn't really meet what our character should produce. And it is important to note that none of these are meant to be suppressed or managed away. They should actually be something that is present in the soul as a functioning response, and they would ideally just simply happen at the right intensity, in the right circumstances, towards the right people, and for the right duration. The formed person, he shouldn't have to think about whether to feel angry or to be angry. The anger should simply arise in the formed person because his character is already ordered in such a way, it has been formed in such a way, so that the response is actually what gets produced naturally. Furthermore, the formed Thumos, the correctly formed Thumos, should also not respond to things that shouldn't affect it. So small slights that actually aren't slights, or perceived disrespect that isn't real disrespect, or just simply the daily provocations that a choleric person will read as worth a response. These things, they are not managed, right? The formed Thumos isn't being managed. It is just a natural expression of the character. The formed person, it doesn't have to talk themselves away from an anger that would otherwise come up. In the correctly formed person, anger doesn't just simply rise, because the perception of this person has actually been trained to see the case at hand accurately, and it will automatically recognize that there isn't really anything here that warrants a response. Ultimately, this is what it looks like when the asymmetric work of character formation has actually been done correctly. The person who once ran hot, who has a hot temper, he doesn't run hot anymore, not because they have somehow suppressed their nature, but because the years of pulling against their nature and correcting their nature has actually reshaped their nature. And the person who once ran cold, who didn't really have a temper, this person can now be moved by what actually should move them, because the work of developing that capacity has done its job. In other words, the natural tilt that each of us started out with simply isn't there anymore. And what's there is now a Thumos that responds correctly to the situation in front of it. And it does so without us having to manage or negotiate with ourselves. And this also connects to everything we have already said about the formed life on this channel. Megalopsychia requires this kind of accurate self-perception about our own worth and our own claim to honor. Decorum required this kind of accurate self-perception of the occasion and the form it actually calls for. And Mesotis required this kind of accurate seeing of one's own natural tilt and the asymmetric work of formation that follows from it. In each of these cases, the formed person doesn't really have to perform a response. They don't have to discipline themselves. The response will just come naturally because the character now does this reflexively without any conscious management on our part. So what we can ultimately say is that the formed Thumos is the spirited part of the soul that has been allied with reason for long enough so that this alliance has actually become its actual nature. And the Thumos that hasn't done this work is the Thumos that is still being managed from the outside. It would be either suppressed because it would otherwise misfire, or it would be fanned because it would otherwise go silent.